Hello everyone, it's Paula Romanow here. This is a re-recording of webinar number 3 in the series Conducting Research, What This Means and How It Applies to Your Role. This is session number 3, Asking the Right Questions. So today we're going to think all about data collection methods for your research. Today's session, we're going to just do a quick recap of session number 2. Few thoughts that you need to think about when you're getting ready to collect your data. We're going to look at some of the methods for data gathering, such as observation, document review, and interviews and focus groups. We have a little case study using the same one that we used last session number 2, just so you can put some of these ideas into practice. And then we have an introduction to looking at surveys. And I will just say in passing that we will do the rest of this in terms of building questions and that kind of stuff in the last of the webinars, webinar number 4. As well as the fact that surveys are a huge, massive topic. And if anyone is interested in having a webinar put together on survey development, just let Connie know. We'd be more than happy to do that for you. Okay, so let's start taking a look at where we were last time. So last time we talked about the action research cycle, which is the type of research that most of you will be doing. It's still very rigorous, but it is perhaps a little less academic in tone, and we looked at the different parts of the research cycle. We looked at the importance of asking the right questions in terms of research questions, how to develop your research questions, and how exactly you use that funnel process to come down to what exactly it is that you're trying to find out. We developed our case study and developed a research question or two around that, and we saw how, depending on what you're wanting to find out, is going to have an impact on the question itself in terms of a hands-on practical piece. And then we looked at how to do lit searches and critical reviews of the literature, which is the first part of the action research cycle. So first part's identify the problem, the second part's do some background research on it, and that's all part and parcel of asking the right questions. And then we started to look at how to design your research plan. So last session was pretty much mostly about designing the research plan, and now we're going to continue that with some consideration of what the appropriate research cycles are going to be, or the research questions and research methods are going to be. So here we go with the action research cycle. So as I said, they are identifying the problems, and then you're going to do background research. And then what we're going to look at this session and a little bit next session is develop action plan and implement and then implementing it. So I'm just going to cough here, just muting the mic for a sec. There, sorry about that. Okay, so off we go. A few thoughts first. One of the things you need to think about when you're considering how you're going to answer your research question is not just where you're going to get your data, but what is the data going to be and is it credible? So when you're thinking about that, because in order to answer the research question, there's no point in gathering data that either has nothing to do with it, or alternately, excuse me, or alternately is not credible. So, picking it off of social media from just Joe Bloggins who said blat about with his own opinion, that kind of stuff. That's not credible data. So you need to think about where you're getting it. You need to do a whole bunch of stuff when you start collecting your data. You need to make sure you're recording stuff carefully and very precisely, whether that's in a checkpoint, whether a checklist, whether that's a transcript, whether you're just making notes, whether you're doing a survey. You need to make sure that you're rigorous in how you record. Don't leave anything out. Especially in qualitative research, there's no such a thing as statistically insignificant. All the data matters. It's not to say you have to get to a stupid level of detail, but you need to make sure you're very thorough and complete in what you're adding. Because the one thing that you think may just sort of be something in passing sometimes turns out to be the most important thing, the most important finding in what you're doing. You need to acknowledge your own biases and recognize the lens you're looking through, and then mitigate those biases. If you remember back to session number 1, we talked about how being a naturalistic or humanistic researcher, as opposed to a positivistic one, you say when you're doing that kind of research, there's no such a thing as pure objectivity. If there's a human being involved, there's going to be subjectivity. However, you need to be very self-reflexive, self-aware, and aware of what your own biases are. And you need to name those right up front so that you can then mitigate them to some extent. So for instance, if I'm doing research as an older, highly educated, middle-class white woman, if I'm doing research with either the African Nova Scotian community or one of the indigenous communities, I can't, there's no way. I can certainly sympathize and I can be interested in what people are doing, but I cannot ever say, oh yes, I'm empathizing with you, or I can identify with that, because I can't. Everybody through their own context has a certain level of inherent bias. It's just what your parents taught you, what the community you grew up in, whatever. You have to be aware of that and recognize that that's the lens you look through, and then try and mitigate it. You need to gather from a lot of sources, not necessarily a lot, but you need to gather from enough that you reach what's called saturation. And what that means is you're not tired of gathering data and you don't want to do it anymore. What it means is, excuse me, that when the data you're collecting starts to become highly repetitive, that's usually an indication that you have reached saturation, which is to say there's nothing else probably of significance that you're going to be able to find. So it may be that you're talking to a community of 400 people and you do focus groups and you manage to cover a third of the community one way or another. And by that point, you've tried to get a representative sample of all the different groups in the community. You're probably going to find that people are starting to repeat themselves. Therefore, you've gotten saturation, and you can then go forward and trust that that data is representative of the group that you're talking to, which followed closely by, of course, gather from the correct sources. So if you're doing information on an African, or you're doing some research with African Nova Scotian communities, depending, of course, on what the research is, talking to a community that is not African Nova Scotian or is geographically located a long way away is probably, depending again on what the topic is, with that little qualifier, probably not going to be helpful for whatever it is you're trying to look at. So make sure you find the correct people, the correct literature, whatever that applies. Look long enough and hard enough. And what that means is, if you're doing a research project and you're designing it, sometimes you have to do it in a very short space of time, because just of the time parameters that you have. But often it's, you have time to plan it out, and you need to put some time into the actual collection. So if you're going to talk to 60 informants, well, that's going to take you probably at least a month by the time you got it scheduled and all the rest of it. And you need to do your scheduling, and you need to look hard enough. You can't just say, oh, yeah, I know these 3 or 4 people, they'll do. You need to make sure that you've got it goes back to correct sources. You've got the people, the important people that you need to talk to, or the data sources that you need to get. I'll talk a little bit more about that in depth, about snowball sampling and that kind of thing a little bit further on. But basically, look long enough and hard enough. Don't just take a cursory glance and think you can zip through a project in a week and expect it to be to have a lot of depth to it. And member check. So I use the example of the African Nova Scotian community. So maybe I'm doing a research project on what are the best practices for program evaluation for African Nova Scotian employment programs. So I need to talk to, I've got all my data. I need to make sure that if 5 people have been interviewed, that they don't all have to agree. And in fact, quite probably some of them are going to violently disagree, not violently, but strenuously disagree with each other. But you need to make sure that there is general consensus on some things at least, so to make sure that you actually have credible data. And I will say that sometimes, especially when you're working with various communities, it's hard sometimes to find that, but you need to at least try. And part of that is that you don't want to be making assumptions based on your own lens. So you need to make sure that the other members on the inside of the group agree with the stuff that's been said. So that's credibility. What kind of access do I have? So it's all very well and good to say, make sure you have the right sources, but do you have access to the right sources? So if you need to talk to school students, for instance, and you want to do a survey around career development in the schools, education in the schools, well, the fact is that with the labor challenges they had last year, you can't actually deliver surveys in the schools. So that's going to be problematic. So I can't access the students without a lot of goings on. So I need to think of a plan A, a plan B, and a plan C. You need to make sure you can access the stuff you need to access. And if you don't, you need to think about other ways that you can find to validate what it is you're looking for. Validity, the degree to which a thing measures what it reports to measure. I can't stress this enough. In order for research to be valid, and it goes back to finding credible data and the correct data sources, there's no point in using, just to use a silly example, you're trying to test people's preferences for fruit and you're giving them vegetables. That's not really going to answer your research question. So you need to make sure that the stuff that you're collecting is appropriate for what it is you're trying to answer. And triangulation is another very important concept, and that's looking at something from more than one perspective. When we talk about data analysis, which is in webinar number 4, we'll look more specifically at how you do triangulation, which is basically having more than one set of eyes doing data analysis, 2 and preferably 3. Just as in journalism, for instance, a journalist may interview one source who says something, say it's a scoop, but if at least 2 other people haven't confirmed what that individual said, it becomes highly suspect. Not always, but as a general rule. That's the idea of triangulation, looking at something from more than one perspective to make sure that you've covered perspectives, but also that there is a depth and agreement in the data that you're looking at. And I just want to say I'm rushing through all this fairly quickly. There's a lot of information. As always, I'll be giving you my contact information at the end of this. But if you have any questions, please, please, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me. More than happy to answer anything or help you with any research projects you got or whatever in design and stuff. So reliability. What reliability means in terms of research is, are there recurring themes, patterns, or items? When we talk about doing qualitative research as opposed to quantitative research, which is numbers and statistics and stuff, we talk about transferability, not generalizability. But what I mean by that is when you're doing, for instance, scientific research, you come up with a hypothesis. So you say, I think that when I put this group of things together, this is what's going to happen. And then you develop a project that you test that hypothesis. And then the idea being that if it's reliable and valid, given the same set of variables, the same result will always occur no matter how many times you do the test run. Well, obviously, when you're dealing with humans, you can't do that because every single individual is different. You can say, I'm going to do a project around career development in grade 6 classrooms. How do we do career development in primary school or elementary school? Well, you could have a school that has 5 different grade 6 classes, and each one of those classes is going to be different because of the teacher involved, because of the students involved. We'll say, for argument's sake, the curriculum's exactly the same, that the school policies are all the same. So there's a framework, but each classroom, because of the individuals involved in it, are going to be slightly different. So what we look for, instead of generalizability, which is to say it's going to be exactly the same every time you do it, what we look for instead is transferability. So this kind of looks at some of that around the best practices concept. If in this particular socioeconomic demographic that populates this school, so maybe it's a school with a high immigrant population, in all the classrooms, because the whole classroom has got a lot of immigrants, even though they come from different backgrounds, and there's some Canadian-born students in it as well. Given the same sort of general framework, ideas that we have in classroom A can be transferred to classroom B, although they may need some tweaking. Some will work, some won't work. But the idea is to look at the idea of transferability. If we use it in one, does it apply, at least in part, to another? So that's the idea of transferability. We need to think about access and power. And I know I talked a lot about this in the first 2 sessions, and I'm going to just hit on it briefly here so as not to beat you over the head with it. But access and power is really important. And by access, I mean not just do you have access to the accurate or to the correct people or data that you need, but also what's the power imbalance in that? So if you're trying to do an evaluation of something, for instance, the people that hired you to do the evaluation, are they making sure that you have access to everything, or are they sort of withholding access to some of the things you need? There's always, in all research, there is a inherent power imbalance between the individual doing the researching and the participants. And that power, that's one of these things you need to put up front. You might be the nicest, most self-effacing, kindest person on the planet, and that's how you present to people. But if you are in a room doing an interview or doing a focus group, there is always, and those of you that do a lot of facilitating know this, there's always a little bit of a power thing. Just because you're at the front of the classroom, even like no matter how much you efface, you're never going to be a participant, even though you facilitate in an idea of co-learning and all the rest of it. The fact is you're still leading it. So there's still a little bit of that power. It's with all research. So you just need to be aware of that. All data gathering methods are capable of creating qualitative and quantitative data, although some are better suited to one than the other. I think I spoke in the last session about the idea that there's quantitative, which is obviously about measuring things. There's qualitative, which is sort of the context piece. And then there's, which I think is usually the most effective way of doing a research project, where appropriate, is there's what's called mixed methods, where you might do a survey to get some quantitative data, and you might conduct some focus groups to get some context around what the survey findings are. You can use surveys to get qualitative information. You know, you think about choose one, and then why did you choose that, and you're expected to write couple sentences. So there's your qualitative information. Just as you can use focus groups to get quantitative data. What was the demographics of the people in this? How many times did they use the word blat, or what was their response to? However, there are some methods that are better suited to one than the other, and we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go on. So no one single data gathering method can guarantee credible data. That's really important too. And that's why I say it doesn't necessarily have to be a mixed methods, but you can use a focus group, an interview, you can use observation. You need to mix up, and it kind of goes back to this idea of triangulation, that the more varied methods you have, the more likely you are to get triangulation, to get confirmation of the data that you've received across platforms. However, having said all that, you also need to be aware of the fact that all data gathering methods can be manipulated. That's really important. And you need to be, the whole idea here is being rigorous. You need to be rigorous in your collection. So you can ask very skewed questions in a survey. You can, we'll talk next webinar about how you put questions together, but if they're not well constructed, if your bad questions result in bad data. And you can do that because you don't know how to do something, or you can do that very intentionally. We've all had markets, like phone market people that have called us up and asked questions like, and why exactly do you like this particular product? When the question really should be, do you like this particular product? So you need to think about that, and that, and like I said, it's not always done out of a sense of evil, but you need to be aware of the fact that you need to be rigorous in how you create your data gathering methods in your design, because you don't want to manipulate and skew the results. And this follows on that all the methods can be contaminated by unrecognized bias. And this goes back to what I said about you have to be very self-aware when you're becoming a researcher, because you need to know what your inborn biases are. And sometimes, the one we're probably most familiar with is language usage. Back in the day, we talk about politically correct language, and, things just inherent in things like saying somebody's a chairman of a board. Well, there's an automatic bias that it's going to be a man running that board or that organization. And so, we change it to chairperson, or just plain chair, which is my preference. And as we know, in this day and age of more and more complex, recognized complexity in terms of self-labeling and self-awareness, we need to be aware of those unrecognized biases in the language that we use, in the questions that we construct, in our own attitudes. And that really will contaminate your data that you're gathering. So you need to, following on all of this, you need to think very consciously about what it is that you're doing, how you're using them, and what you're using them for. Otherwise, you're going to endanger your credibility. If somebody's doing an evaluation and it's very skewed in favor of finding, well, you do that once or twice and people are going to say, well, not a very good evaluator, because honestly, she just said, yeah, this is great. And even though the way the project was put together sort of leads you down that it wasn't very well done, that's going to in time make people say, you're not very good at doing this. And the data that you come up with, or the findings you come up with, are not credible and not usable. So research method is a toolbox. One of my profs used to say this, and you need in theory, as we talked about. So method is a toolbox, and you need the right tool for the job. It's just a toolbox. There's nothing magical about it. It's just skill sets. So we're going to look at some of these tools today. We're going to look at observation. We're going to look at document analysis. We're going to look at some ways to talk to informants. And we'll look at the beginning of surveys. And like I said, the rest of that will be done in webinar number 4. So the first one we're going to look at is observation. As a general rule, observation can be very useful, especially if you're doing an evaluation. The definition of observation in terms of research is a systematic, and again that word systematic, method of data gathering that relies on the researcher's ability to gather data through their senses. So not just sight, not just hearing, but sometimes, depending on what it is you're doing the research on, sometimes it's touch. Sometimes it's taste, and going back to my fruit example, but using your own senses, and it's your own interpretation. It's quite often used to add additional context or to begin the emergent process. By what I mean, if you don't know very much about the thing that you're supposed to be researching, sometimes going in and doing an observation in a work site, for instance, if you're trying to find out, I don't know, how your clients are using the resource center at the front of your your center. Well, the easiest way to find that out, I mean, there's many methods that you're probably going to want to use, but if you don't have a clue where to even begin to put together a survey or questionnaire or anything else, is just to go in and sit in there for a couple hours and watch and see what things are doing. And that becomes part of what we call an emergent process, which is it's a good starting point. Or alternately, you've already done that and you want to find out, again, triangulation. So I've got all these survey responses. I want to find out two things. One, was the survey put together properly? Did it ask the right questions? Or if you're doing interview stuff, are they actually doing what they said they were doing? You then go in and you sit down there for a couple hours and just sort of do an observation. Having said that, it's kind of tricky because when you know what it's like when you put a microphone or a camera in front of somebody's face, it changes their behavior. It's almost impossible to be, and I'll talk about that in a second, to do observation without actually changing the behavior of the people being observed. It's really hard to remove your own interpretation or biased or contextual lens out of it. If you think about the old, back around the turn of the last century, the anthropologists like Margaret Mead, going into these, the various cultures in the South Seas, in the South Pacific, and coming at it with a Western white Christian lens and watching what they were doing, and of course interpreting it from that lens because they didn't have another lens to do it. And in those days, actually asking people, "So what are you doing?" There was a bit of a white privilege thing going on there, but you're interpreting it, and the way you're interpreting it through your own lens is not necessarily what is actually going on, as many of those early anthropologists found out. So it can be tricky to redo, and it's sometimes really difficult, especially when you're dealing with client observation, to not let your own biases show through. Like, geez, that's not a very good way to do a database search, or I told them to Google and all they're doing is looking at Kijiji, that kind of stuff. You need to, instead of saying client accessed the center, but what they really ended up doing, or spent X amount of time not using the computer for job searching, but for other purposes. So that's an important finding, but you're taking your own bias out of it. You're just saying, this is what happened, not interpreting that. I'm not making a judgment. I'm just stating the case. And the problem, of course, is that you can't actually interact with the participants. All you can do is observe them. So you can't actually ask them the questions about what they're doing to broaden out the understanding. You can simply write it down. Just like developing survey questions, developing the checklists, the themes, the activities, the stuff that you need to do to conduct an observation systematically can be very complex to develop and to use the proper protocols in place. It certainly can be done, but it can be quite complex. So you need to think about non-participants versus participants. Who exactly is doing the observing? Are you getting participants to observe each other, for instance, if you're in a teaching situation? are you, as the researcher who is not a participant doing the observation, whose data are you collecting? And then we get into this whole overt versus covert observation. I'm sure most of you have heard of psychological testing, where it's behind the one-way mirror, so that kids or whatever, are in a room and they're doing their thing and they're being observed, but they don't know they're being observed. It's one way to get away from the people's behavior changing. But if they don't know they're being observed, then you've just crossed the ethical boundaries into a place you don't want to go. So you need to think very much about informed consent when you're doing covert observation. The flip side of that is when you're doing overt, or like you're sitting in the room, people can see you doing this, is again that change in behavior, and it sometimes gets very artificial. Structured observation, you have predetermined criteria, so you've made up a checklist of the things that you think you're going to see. You have a checklist, so you do that, and you're just simply at a remove checking off what you see and what you don't see, or not checking off what you don't see. Semi-structured, I'm always a big fan of the semi-structured anything. You have the checklists and schedules, but you're also making notes on things that aren't covered by this. So it's like structured interviews. For those of you that have your CCDP, you went through the structured interview process, and you know that those questions were asked of every single CDP that went through this process. It's the same questions. The assessors are not allowed to change the words. They can't give you help beyond the very prescriptive probes that they've got. It's very predetermined, which means you can't stray, which means quite often that you're missing out on some data that would probably be really useful. Semi-structured says, okay, we're going to ask the same questions out of everybody, or make the same observations with the checklist, but I'm also going to make a note of things that aren't on my checklist that might be important. Again, it's kind of an emergent thing. And then finally, unstructured, which can be tricky to do. No predetermined criteria, simple observation. It's just go down and you start making notes about everything you see that's going on. The reason I like the semi-structured over the other two so much is that it gives you a baseline across the board, so for all the participants, but it also allows you to make note of things that are really interesting that you can then explore further, which may not show up in every observation or every interview, but that are still things that you think might be quite significant. Okay, so I'm going to give you a time here. I'm going to not pause as long as I did when this was live, simply because there's nobody to respond to it. But I'm going to pause for a minute, and if you need longer than that, I'm going to give you the case study, or the question, and I'll give you a minute to write down your answers, and then I will give you some of the answers that, a couple examples from my own experience, that if you need more time than that, then I would suggest you just hit pause on this recording. Okay, so question is, can you think of a time when using observation would be an appropriate data gathering method in your own work? Okay, I'm now muting the mic for a minute. All right, I'm back. I'll give you an example from my own work. We have a lot of students that work, we have some students that work for us at the CEI as research interns and as engagement interns. Some of us have offices and some of us have desks in a large open workspace. Some of the students, the feedback has been that it's problematic sometimes working in a large open, like a bullpen kind of situation. And so because of the noise, and they find it hard to concentrate. So unbeknownst to them, as I've been sort of drifting through, I've been kind of keeping it, and it helps that my office is across the hall from this space, just keeping a sort of general eye on the noise level. So, and also whether or not some students, maybe they're on Facebook, maybe they're on, whatever, aren't working particularly effectively at times. So just an observation is just to observing what the sound levels are as a general rule in that bullpen, of which there are 5 desks, and alternately just kind of wandering through just to take a peek at what people actually have on their screens. Now, the latter part of that is not particularly ethical. Perhaps there could be a potential problem with ethics in that one. So again, when you're doing observation, you need to think about that stuff, but it doesn't hurt to kind of keep an eye. If I walk past an individual's desk, say every half hour or so, or a couple times in the afternoon, and every time I walk past their desk, they got Facebook up, or they're cruising the web or whatever, then I'm probably in time going to have a conversation about what's appropriate usage of their time and what isn't. And it's but again, because my presence in the room is going to change their behavior potentially. But those are some examples of when observation. Now, that's not specifically to do with research, but it could be research if you're looking at the efficiency of having clients, or have whomever working in a open concept space. How does that work? So there's a place that you might use observation. Okay, document review. This is, if you remember the first part of the research cycle, or second part rather, about do your research. Well, document review is a really good place to start with it. The definition would be the collection, review, interrogation, by which we mean critical reading of, and analysis of various types of text. And text doesn't always just mean the written word. It can mean the written word, but it also means graphics, images, whatever, as a primary source of research data. So let's say, for instance, that you are trying to determine whether your organizational policy around use of the computer lab is useful. Well, it helps, first of all, to read the policy, see what's in it. Then you might do an observation to see how people are actually using the space, or the resource center being a good example of that. And then you might also do some research around how do other centers, how have they got their resource centers set up, and some of the findings around that. That is a primary source of research data. The policy itself is your primary source. The others will become primary sources as well, but it's what you use to get a start on something. It can be good for both contexts. So like I said, the policies, maybe you're trying to determine how those policies came into place. Well, then you can look at some historical archival documents to see, meeting minutes, memos, those kinds of things. And you look at standard operating procedures. What are your, that kind of stuff, the actual procedural policies in place. So that's the context around whatever your project is. And it can also be used, as I said, as primary data. You need to think about access to it, because what if you don't have access to the stuff you need? Well, then you're going to have a hard time answering your research question, just like if you don't have access to the proper individuals. So you need to, if you're trying to figure out what is the federal government policy on something or other, that you can't actually get your hands on it because it's confidential and for federal employees only, well, then you have a problem, and you need to think about another way of finding out this information. There's always secondary sources that talk about the primary sources, and that can be a good sort of way to get into it sideways. You also need to think about the management of it. So for instance, when I was doing my PhD dissertation, I had over 1,000 articles and books and images and other stuff that were hard copies, because I was doing this back in 2002. And So the digital versions of stuff weren't quite as prevalent. So I had to think about storing all this stuff, just the physical space required. I had to think about how I was actually going to do the analysis of it. I had to think about all kinds of stuff. And nowadays, and I'll talk more about this next webinar, nowadays there's actually other things that you can do with some of the qualitative data analysis software where you can store it, upload it, and store documents, and then do the coding and stuff all online, which is useful. But that's not always the case, and those softwares are not cheap. So you need to think about, how am I actually going to manage all this stuff? And sampling. If you're, for instance, so out of my 1,000 articles that I used in the dissertation, I probably looked at 3,000. And there comes a point in time where you just can't do that anymore. So you need to make sure you're finding a representative sample. Maybe you're trying to look at a particular kind of policy, of which there's been a lot of work done on it. Well, you need to figure out what's the important stuff and then concentrate on finding stuff around that, for instance. And critical interrogation. So what that means is, when you're reading this stuff or looking at it, or however you're decoding it, what you need to look at it critically. That's not to mean negatively. It just means you need to be aware of who wrote it, what the context was, where is it being used, how is it being interpreted, all those kinds of questions. So you need to look at stuff critically, but you also need to try and keep your own biases out of it. For instance, if you're doing some research around political, government policies on career development stuff, and maybe you are not very keen on this government or perhaps the previous one, and you're reading the policy and you're getting a little cranky because you totally disagree with what you're reading, well, that's fair. You're allowed to do that, but you cannot allow that to bias your reading of it. Which is to say that if you don't agree with something, you need to be able to articulate, not just, I hate this person, but why, and do it in a logical and rational way. So you need to read it critically, but look at it with an unbiased or unjaundiced view. So that's the basics of document review. By far and away, the thing you're probably going to use the most, though, is various ways of talking to informants. And we're going to concentrate on two of those methods, which are interviews and focus groups. So interviews are by far the most common form of qualitative data gathering. And that they're really, it's that because you're getting the first voice data, you're actually getting the voice of the participants, not your interpretation of it, but actually what they're saying. And hopefully you're getting some really good quotes, which takes, like you're going to do some analysis of all this stuff to be sure, but you're looking at what it is they're saying, not what you say they're saying. And you can actually, take quotes out and all the rest of it. Again, the whole issue around access. Do you actually have access to the people that you need to talk to? Key informants, the people that actually have the information that you need. And also time constraints. One thing about doing interviews, especially one-on-one interviews, is it takes a lot of time to schedule and set up, especially if you're having to travel to get to them. So if you're on a tight timeline and you're trying to schedule a bunch of interviews, you need to factor that into your design. So if there are probably 40 people that you think, I really need to talk to these people, but you've only got 10 days to do it in, the odds are pretty good that you're not actually going to get to talk to all 40 of them, just for pure and simple time constraints and their availability. So again, you need to always be thinking of a plan B. So this goes back to what I said around the observation methods. So I'll move through this fairly quickly. An open interview is just where you're having a chat. You're having a conversation. You're going in maybe just thinking about your research question in your mind, but you don't have anything in particular on paper to go. You're just going to let the conversation go where it goes. That can be very valuable, but it can also be very tangential, and you can waste a lot of time not getting much information. Plus, you don't have a baseline of data to take from person to person, which comes up to semi-structured, which, as I already told you, speaking of bias, I have a very strong bias towards semi-structured interviews as data gathering method, because you have that schedule of questions. So everybody's being asked the same question, so you have the same baseline data. But then through the course, it's also a conversation, and through the course of that conversation, they may be saying things you want to follow up on. So you might be talking to a client who says, using the resource center, and so you're doing an interview, and how do you find it? And then in the process of talking to them, so you're asking everybody the same questions, but somebody maybe says, I find it really difficult to use the computers because my literacy, I don't read very well, or my eyesight's bad. Well, gosh, now all of a sudden you're gone off into a whole realm of adaptive technology, or how you deal with issues around literacy. And that becomes an emergent, maybe in the process of asking this, you hear 2 or 3 people saying that. Well, that's a real key finding, that the resource center is really awesome, but people are saying, you know what, I just, as much as I like computers, I don't really know how to use them, and I have trouble seeing the screen. So you go back to your manager, or if you are the manager, and you say, gee whiz, maybe we need to think about getting some adaptive technology for a couple of the computers in our resource center. You can spread stuff out. You can go off on useful tangents and go from there. And then again, the structured interview, as like I said, use the example of the structured interview in the CCDP process. It's a predetermined order. Everybody gets asked exactly the same thing. The answers, of course, may differ, but you don't do any following up. You don't stray from any of the questions asked. I don't know. They're not my favorite thing, but then I'm not a very structured person by nature, as you have no doubt gathered going through these webinars with me. So how do you do this? How do you put this together? The first thing is you need to develop a plan. So you need to think about always through all of this, the core thing is, what is my research question? Who do I need to talk to find out some information about what it is I'm trying to answer? What is my access? What is my role in this, in the interview? Are there language or cultural challenges? Again, I go back to the example of if I'm going into the African Nova Scotian or Indigenous community, I'm coming in from a particular context which has some cultural ramifications, shall we say. And you have to be aware of that. So you need to think about that. Maybe if you're dealing, especially if you're dealing with a particularly tricky topic, you might need to enlist the help of somebody who's from that particular group to help you with the data gathering, and especially with the interviews. Language, if you're speaking to new Canadians, sometimes language can be a barrier. You always need to have a plan B, and I prefer to have a plan C and D, in case it doesn't work out. Maybe you can't get enough of the data, and you need to think, is there another way I can find out stuff from these people? And you need to think about the length. If you're going to do a 2-hour interview with somebody, you need to tell them, I'm doing a 2-hour interview with you. If you're going to do a 45-minute one, when you get in there and they're really, really interesting and they're going way past the 45-minute mark, then you need to say, this is really interesting. Do you mind if we take some more time? Sometimes they don't. Most often they won't mind, but sometimes they went, well, no, you said 45 minutes and I'm sorry, we're now at an hour and I've got other things to do. So you need to think about all these things when you're developing your plan. So the interview schedule, and that's just the list of questions, the research term is schedule, and recording method. You want to think about recording this stuff, especially because some people aren't comfortable having a mic in front of them, and then you'll need to make notes. But it's a real skill to be able to make notes while really paying attention and following. And then there's the whole body language ramifications, because it kind of feels to the person being interviewed like you're not really paying attention, despite all you're doing is making notes. So if you can record it, whether on your phone or whether you've got a little digital tape recorder or whatever, or videotape, you absolutely should be doing that. But you need to make sure that the person that you're interviewing is cool with that. And that's all part of the whole informed consent process, which I talked about before. So use the same process when you're developing, you're winnowing your questions down. You don't want to ask 58 questions. You want to ask maybe 6 or 8, especially if it's a semi-structured interview, because there'll be lots of other stuff. So make sure you're asking the most pertinent stuff to answer the research question. The number of questions you ask, of course, is going to be determined by the amount of time you have, and it's almost invariable, unless the people are not giving you very good responses, that you're going to run out of time and you're going to rush through the last ones. So you need to think about that. Make sure that your questions, just like when you develop a survey, are very clear. Make sure they're not confusing, they're not leading, by which I mean you're asking a question and signaling very clearly in the question, like I said about, so how did you like our product, or did you know how, kind of thing, that you're actually showing them what you're wanting them to answer. And that the question isn't going to be problematic for informants. So especially when you're dealing with talking to clients, sometimes you bring stuff up inadvertently, excuse me, and you don't realize that that's a topic that may be a trigger for people, that you asked quite innocently and it didn't. So you need to think about that. Who are my population? Are there things around what I'm talking about? And you can still ask the question. You just have to be careful how you phrase it. You need to make sure there's a logical flow. Usually when you're developing an interview schedule, is that you start with sort of this, like when you're doing a survey, softball question. So, hi, how are you? How did you come here? Can you tell me a little bit about yourself? Sort of those kinds of questions that just put people at ease, more or less. You also need to think about probes, especially if you're doing a structured interview. And probes are simply follow-up questions. So somebody says something that's really interesting to you, and you need to think about, so what's a subsequent question that I can ask to get more information out of them on this topic. And then, like I said, if you're going to tape it or just take notes, and whatever you do, you need to have permission. But that all comes down to the informed consent form. So you need to do, once you've got all that done, you need to do a test run with some colleagues, and quite likely or if you've got a couple, start off, with a couple people just to see how it goes, and adjust as necessary. Maybe the questions aren't clear. Maybe people are saying, well, you've asked that same thing 6 times, but in different language. So you need to think about all those things. So you do a beta test of it, and then you adjust it before you go out and start your data gathering for real. So that's interviews. That's one-on-one stuff. When you're trying, when you don't have a ton of time, sometimes and even sometimes when you do, it's more useful and efficient to do a focus group. And anybody that's facilitated is familiar with the concept of a focus group, which is just a small group discussion led by a facilitator around a specific topic. Excuse me. It's useful for gathering a lot of data in a relatively short space of time. So if you've only got that 10 days to try and get all your data collected for whatever reason, a focus group can be the best way of doing it. So instead of interviewing the clients using the resource center one-on-one, on a particular day, you've asked permission of a bunch of them to actually come and have a chat with you about it. And so 6 of them agree to do that, and you sit down in a room and you ask the questions you would ask in a one-on-one interview, but you would ask it, you ask it to the group. Typically, focus groups, I have seen them larger, but it becomes really hard to manage them if they're more than 12 or 15 people. Because it becomes difficult to figure out who's saying what. And quite often, as we know in groups, there tends to be 1 or 2 people that sort of hog the microphone and they're doing all the speaking. And then there's going to be a whole whack of people that never get a chance to say anything. So when you have a smaller group, it's easier to manage. And so to make sure that the people that aren't saying very much, that you can actually, single them, not single them out as in, why aren't you speaking? But as in so we've heard from everybody else, but perhaps, you, Joe, we haven't heard from you yet. Could you, what do you think about this? It's easier to manage a fewer the people. You can have as few as 3 people, but you're probably not, depending on the topic as always, but you're probably not going to get as valuable data, because one of the good things that happens in a focus group is that people tend to ping off each other, and they kind of start brainstorming and the data starts to flow. And again, the importance of being able to facilitate it, because boy, you have a safe space and you need to make sure it's a safe space. And like I said, sometimes there's 1 or 2 people that sort of hijack the whole process and go off down their own particular rabbit hole. And that's not always a pleasant rabbit hole for them to be going down. So you need to make sure, A, it's a safe space, and you need to lay the ground rules out, just like when you're doing any kind of facilitation or a workshop or whatever. These are the rules of engagement, basically. That's a military term. I know not everybody loves it, but basically that's what you're doing. It's a safe space, and we can agree to disagree, but we need to do it respectfully. And you need to make sure that all voices are heard. So that's, again, why the importance of it being a facilitative process. You can tape focus groups, but it can be very confusing, especially if it's just an audio tape, because you don't know who's speaking, because you know that people are going to be talking over each other, especially if they get into an animated conversation. And when you're trying to decode it, when after the fact, it can be really hard to hear, and it can be equally difficult to understand, to know who said what. As a general rule, it's in my experience, it's better to just flip chart responses, just as you would do in a facilitated workshop, or alternately, if you have a second person helping you, who's taking very detailed notes on their laptop or by pen or whatever. As long as you're collecting the data, that's the important thing. In a focus group, because there's probably going to be, you've got more people to talk, you want a lot fewer questions. So typically in a focus group, I would say no more than 4 or 5. And again, it's always a semi-structured interview, so you can go off down tangents if you need it to allow for the richness of discussion. So I'm going to let you take a minute and give it a try. So here's your situation. You've noticed that while all of your job search workshops are well attended, only 37% of the individuals who go through the entire suite of pre-employment workshops, which are made up of resume writing, interview skills, employability skills, and portfolio development, only 37% of the attendees actually find employment within 3 months of completion. So you're trying to figure out why aren't more people able to use this stuff and to become attached. The evaluation forms that you do at the end of every workshop indicate that they like it and find the information useful, but the workshops are not translating into successful attachment. So you're trying to find out why. So we've agreed that the central problem, remember we had this conversation, this was from the last session, agreed that the central problem in the example is, why are only 37% of job search skills suite participants, that's hard to say, participants able to successfully find employment upon completion? So what I want you to do is identify what method you'd use to gather your data and why you chose those. And then what are a couple of the questions that you might put into the schedule? I'm just going to mute the mic for a few seconds, and I would suggest that you pause the webinar at this point and answer put your answers down. That's what I'm trying to say. Write your answers down. Okay, so surveys is the next topic. And just to go back to the previous one, what are some of the methods that we might use to do that? Well, maybe you need to take a look at your evaluation form. So maybe you need to discuss with the participants, you need to do some post-workshop follow-ups, which if you're case managing them, you're probably going to do that anyway. But maybe your evaluation form is not appropriate for use here, that you're not asking the right questions. So I would probably suggest that you do a focus group, probably maybe 6 weeks after the workshop, among the people that aren't attached. You also want to talk to the people that did get attached. What parts of the workshop did they use to do this? Sorry about that, folks. Yeah, as you can tell, I'm in an office doing this. So that might be the questions. What things maybe needed to be done more, what needed to be done less, that kind of thing. So very quickly, because we don't have much time left, I want to just take the beginnings of the look through surveys and how to put a survey together. And I will say developing surveys properly is an art form, is an absolute art form. And there are people that do entire degrees in this kind of stuff, usually attached to a statistics kind of thing. And so I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, but I will say that, again, if anybody is interested in doing a separate webinar specifically on surveys, I'd be very happy to do that. Just get in touch with myself or Connie and we'll see what we can do. So why are surveys useful? Well, you can reach a large number of respondents. So focus groups, interviews are one-on-one. Focus groups are, sort of up to 15. But if you want to reach a ton of people, then the survey is the way to go. That generates standardized, quantifiable, empirical data. We talked about that, about the appropriateness of things. It's confidential and anonymous, especially if they're online surveys, because you don't, you send them out and people send them back and you don't know where they came from, especially if it's done through something like SurveyMonkey or whatever. It can also generate qualitative data through use of open-ended questions. So surveys in some way are the perfect mixed method. So those, and so they can be really, really useful if you're trying to find out just attitudinal or demographic types of data. However, the negative parts of them are that respondents can't seek clarifications and they can't ask follow-up questions. Now, we've all done surveys or multiple choice tests or whatever that you're going, well, it could be this, but it could also be that. And if the STEM, which is the question part of a survey, isn't clear, then people, need, if it's not put together well, then people need to, they need to ask clarification or you're getting ineffective data. So they need to be very carefully constructed and the questions need to be precise. Webinar 4, we're going to look specifically at very briefly, but looking at how to construct what makes up a good question and what makes up a bad question. Badly constructed surveys result in bad data. That goes with any of these methods that we're talking about, garbage in, garbage out, basically. So you need to think about that and be very, very rigorous. Take a lot of time remember that Einstein thing about taking most of the time to develop the question? Well, the same goes with your design. You want to make sure the design is rigorous. The problem with surveys is that you can send out 300 and get, if you're lucky, 50 back. The response rates tend to be very low. When they're more useful is if you actually are just, you have captive audience, for instance, at a workshop, like an evaluation form, and you give them that. So typically you need to send out a lot more than you might normally, simply because you need to account for the number that you're probably going to get back. So constructing a good survey, you need to think about, is a survey the right tool? Again, it goes back to, and what is my response if I don't get the right? Maybe you'd be better off holding a series of focus groups with fewer people. Maybe the survey isn't the right tool. Constructing the right questions isn't easy. And like I said, we'll cover more of this next session. You need clear instructions. You need plain language. You need very simple, non-complex questions, and you need to think about the flow. Usually you put the demographic questions first, male, well, I can't even say male, female anymore. How do you self-identify, whatever. Age, and you put the age range in and all that kind of stuff, just to get people going on it, just to get them into the flow of doing it. One of the things I will say to you, and I don't mean this nastily, but never underestimate people's inability to think clearly around what they're reading. You might read something and think it's insanely clear, and how could they possibly not understand that? Or they didn't read half the directions. Yeah, people don't always read everything in front of them. Never underestimate that. So you need to make it clear, you need to make it simple, and you need to give them every single possible direction for them to follow. And then you need to pilot it to make sure that the people doing it actually are, that it is clear. So just like you piloted or did a sort of beta test of your interview questions, Well, it's the same thing with a survey. You need to run it through some people to take a look at it and see if it's going to work or not, or if there's things that need tweaking, and then you need to tweak them, and then you need to distribute them. And how you distribute them is, well, I mean, it's usually by email, electronically, whether in this day and age, you probably aren't going to do a mail out as much as you might because of the cost and everything else. Maybe you're doing it in person, whatever it is, but you need to make sure that you can distribute it to the numbers of people that you want. So that's the beginnings of the survey, and we'll look more at that at the beginning of webinar number 4, which is, now that you've gathered your data, what are you going to do with it? And that's covered in the last of these webinars, data analysis and reporting your findings. So as always, if you have questions, please get in touch with me. That's my email address. That's my direct line to my office. Always happy to help you with any questions you have about research, about surveys, about anything. And feedback on this will be coming out. So we'll be looking forward to hearing that from you. So thanks, everyone. And we'll see you for the next webinar, webinar number 4. Take care. Bye-bye.